You've caught me. Seen if my name's in this year's rich list. Look, 200 wealthiest Australians. Number 200 is 700 million and number 1 is 31.5 billion. Can't find my name anywhere. I was after that beautiful yacht, and the Gucci handbag looks like I can't afford it. Now, more seriously, it's interesting when you look at garbage like that to see where people make their money. And fascinating, in Australia it's mainly resources, followed by property development, followed by technological innovation, so the whiz kids. But interestingly, number 1 is always resources. If I said to you, Australians are in exactly the same positions as West Papuans, you'd laugh. You'd say, well, our standard of living is better. We're not under a military dictatorship. Things are much better in Australia and West Papua, but relatively, we find ourselves in exactly the same situation. West Papuans find themselves strangers in their own countries under a military dictatorship and have lost over 500,000 people in this 60-year war for independence because they have resources. They have fish, they have timber, and most important of all, they have gold at Freeport. A mountain of gold which has been mined now for almost 40 years and continues to produce extraordinary amounts of gold. But the wealth does not go back to the West Papuans. It doesn't even go back to those Indonesians that have migrated to West Papua. It stays in the hands of transnational and multinational corporations and individuals like you see in that rich list. Now let's move to Australia. Now we think, you can hear the birds in the background, we think we live in the land of milk and honey. Let's forget our origins as a country. Let's forget that the first piece of legislation that went through the federal parliament, the new federal parliament in 1901, when Australia gained its independence, was the White Australia policy. Let's forget about that. Let's forget about the dispossession, the colonisation. Let's forget about all that. The inability to actually acknowledge the past, let alone make repatriations or move towards reconciliation or a treaty. Let's forget about all that. Let's look at the situation in Australia in the 21st century in 2021. Australia doesn't ride on the sheep's back. It did ride on the sheep's back. Australia doesn't depend on its agricultural exports. Australia's wealth is tied to the resources in the ground. And I've spoken about this before, but I think the rich list which comes out every year highlights how important resources are in this country. Resources like bauxite, iron ore, uranium, gold, diamonds, opals, rare metals, titanium, zinc, copper, and the list goes on and on and on. This is an old continent full of resources which the 21st century world needs, especially a world that's moving into a renewable energy which is dependent on battery power, battery storage, and all the rare metals and materials that are required to produce the new green capitalism. So, what's the issue? Well, the issue is very simple. Well, I see people protesting about the fact they have to wear a mask in order to protect their fellow citizens. I don't see people protesting about the fact that over 700,000 children living in poverty in this country. I don't see people protesting about the fact that 1 in 3 people rely on inadequate social security benefits to survive. I don't see people protesting about the fact that the median house price in Sydney and Melbourne is over $1 million. That's for a 3-bedroom house in some nondescript suburb. I don't see people protesting about the insecurity in our society. And when you look at it realistically, why has this nation and successive governments of all political hues allowed resources which belong to this country's First Nations people and the rest of us, why have they allowed these resources to be placed in private hands to develop them? I mean, one of the most obscene pictures I've ever seen in my life was, I think, in around 10 years ago, when Gina Rinehart, who continues to be Australia's richest individual for personal wealth, not a company wealth, but a personal wealth of over $31.5 billion, protesting because the Labor government, this is actively protesting in a protest, because the Rudd Labor government was going to introduce a super profits tax to ensure there was resources to deal with those children living in poverty, to deal with the huge amount of issues which we face as a society every day. Inadequate public health care, inadequate mental health care, privatisation, and the list goes on and on. Not one child should be living in poverty in this country. Not one adult should be living in poverty. We should have a universal basic income for every individual. Not one Australian should be in insecure work. We shouldn't have to rely on overseas guest workers, to keep this country functioning. And the list goes on and on. And it's all related to the fact that we do not own our resources. I mean, what have anybody in that rich list done over the last 12 months to acquire wealth? How many people's labour have they used? How many people's labour have they exploited? How many tax loops have they taken advantage of? When 1 in 3 companies pays no tax, you realise there's something wrong in this country. So let's go back to this resources question. What happens now is we give individuals and corporations like BHP, Rio Tinto, Kerry Stokes, Gina Rinehart, and the list goes on and on, the ability to own, develop resources, and we rely on their employees paying tax, and in some situation we rely on some peppercorn royalties. Now, why shouldn't this wealth belong to the people of this country? Why shouldn't the nation, through taxpayers, bankroll the developing of these resources so we can benefit from the production or the introduction of another super fund, not the current pathetic one we have now, but a super fund which is based on profits which are made from resources which then could be ploughed into infrastructure, universal basic income, eradicating poverty, improving people's lives, making this the richest and most developed country, nation on this planet. Because we have those resources, but we have decided as a people to give away those resources to people who then develop them and take the profits. This is the black hole that they talk about when they talk about an economic black hole. This is the black hole, the fact that we do not control our resources. We do not own our resources. People say, oh, but I have a superannuation fund and my superannuation fund invests in Rio Tinto and I get something back. Well, the reality is what's going to happen to your superannuation fund, it's going to be used to look after you in your old age. Why shouldn't the state look after you in your old age? Why should the private sector exploit your resources to the day you die? So if you think your superannuation is going to save you, it's not going to save you. It's illusory. It's a plaything which is used by the private sector to maximise profits for people, investing on the stock market. That's all it has become. So let's get back. So what should we do? That's the key. Should I have to read every year a 200 rich list? Should I see people making extraordinary profits, $10,000 a second? People earning more than 2 Social Security or 20 Social Security beneficiaries would be given in a year. Do I need to look at that? Do I need to live in a country which is so resource rich and so poor in so many aspects, culturally, development-wise? Even the response to COVID-19 has been pathetic, the pathetic rollout of vaccination. The fact that we don't have purpose-built quarantine centres, broadacre quarantine centres, which deal, there's something they knew about in the 19th, if not the 18th century. Think of what could be done with these resources. So what am I suggesting? Well, I'm going to suggest something which we should be fighting for. I'm going to suggest that these resources be taken back without compensation for the major players. They've got enough money. Without compensation. Take them back. Without compensation. Not buy them back, but take them back and use them for the benefit of the people through legislation, through a legislative agenda, through a political campaign based on nationalising resources for the common good, not for private profit. Obviously, smaller players will be compensated, but as far as the larger players are concerned, no compensation whatsoever. None. A radical change. A total radical change in the way we approach the issue of resources. And if you think this is some type of communist plot or socialist plot or anarchist plot, well, I'm afraid it's not. The Norwegian government developed its North Sea resources in such a way as the majority of the profits, the Norwegian government developed its North Shore oil resources in such a way as the bulk of the profits went into a future fund to look after future generations of Norwegian. Now, Norway is a capitalist society. It's a liberal democratic society. They decided their resources belong to the people, not to a handful of billionaires who you see in a rich list, or transnational corporations like BHP and Rio Tinto who've got resources around the world. In many regards, the initial invasion of Iraq had everything to do with the fact that the Iraqi government, irrespective of what you thought about it, nationalised Iraqi's oil supplies for the benefit of the Iraqi people. And a lot of that invasion had to do with putting those oil resources back in private hands, which they are today. And around the world we have seen different governments, as the Venezuelan government, attempt to nationalise resources and find themselves in all types of difficult situations. And the main reason for that is that private interests dominate development of resources around the planet. Whether it's multinational corporations, whether it's corrupt dictatorships which go into alliances with transnational corporations, whether it's situations like Freeport in West Papua, where physical force is used to ensure that continues. Whether in Bougainville, just across the road from Australia, in Bougainville, a 10-year war which closed down the Bougainville mine because the people were sick and tired of being exploited, and they conducted their own revolt, which led to an Australian blockade of the island, which helped an island of less than 50,000 people. Over 10,000 people died directly as a result of New Guinea intervention and the Australian blockade. So it is a difficult path. It's not an easy path. But we need to put these ideas into the public arena. Today, the talk about is accommodating these billionaire developers. It's better allowing them to amass more and more profits. One person can only sleep in one bed every night. Think about it. It doesn't matter if you've got 100 mansions or $31 billion in the bank, you still shit and piss, and you still eat, and you still sleep. You don't need all that. So the reality is that we are at a critical juncture in the way we approach life in this country. Do we continue to follow the same drumbeat? Private investment, private profit, private investment, private profit. The heck with everybody else. Do we continue to allow governments to be dominated by the agenda of transnational corporations and wealthy individuals who believe they can and do manipulate the political process, so legislation which ensures wealth is shared never sees the light of day, and more importantly, is never raised or discussed in any medium? So if you are interested in taking this further, if you're interested in being involved in a political organisation that is interested in nationalisation of resources and using that wealth for the common good, not for private profit, to be based on the concept of no compensation for that nationalisation, well, then I strongly suggest you join public interest before corporate interests. We need another 97 members on the Australian electoral roll, the federal electoral roll, in order before we can apply for registration as a federal political party. Whether we apply before this election or not doesn't really matter. What matters is that we get involved in that political process, because they don't care if you protest. They don't care if you go on a hunger strike. They don't care if you have mental issues because of the situation you find themselves in, as long as the profits keep rolling in. What they care about is when people muscle in on their turf. And public interest before corporate interest as a federally registered political party would muscle in on their turf. And even if you receive 1% of the vote in a federal electorate, that 1% could be the critical vote which ensures that political parties that may have similar agendas, not the same but similar agendas, become elected to Parliament and change the parliamentary debate about who should own our resources and who should benefit from the exploitation of those resources, and how we should accommodate and enter a treaty into this resource development with this country's First Nations people. Think about it. If you think you're somehow a little bit different to what's happening in West Papua, it's exactly the same story over and over again. Only you can change it. I can't change it. You can't change it. But we can change it together as a new political, social and cultural force in this country.